Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming back after the break, and I'm delighted that Richard Cotter has agreed to chair our first panel discussion, which is on military tribunals and torture. So I'll pass it over to you, Richard, to chair this session.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you first of all for all the participants are here. It's evening and still there are people here, quite a few of them, after a full-flung steaming ahead conference with excellent keynote speeches and then an excellent academic panel of papers before. So we've got, you might have seen out on the website, we've got 4 distinguished panelists. And the format would be that each of them has 5-10 minutes to sort of set up opening statements, observations, and then we'll go from there and get a discussion going. And then people who are participating should either raise the digital hand and or put a question in the chat. Unless people speak their own name, I won't name their name, because as you know, this is recorded, and that was a discussion we had as conference organizers this morning. So I did suggest to the panelists, but we can rejig that if you like, the order of Andy Worthington, investigative journalist and Guantánamo expert, going first, and Tracy Dorick from Freedom from Torture coming afterwards, and Michelle Paradis from the Columbia Law School, but also a senior attorney at the US Department of Defense, coming third in the opening, and then Norman Baker, former UK minister and Liberal Democrat member of Parliament of the House of Commons. That would be the idea. Andy, how about...
Sorry, I lost my connection there for a minute, and I don't seem to have video of me at the moment. Can you see me?
No.
Okay.
Can't see you. We can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there.
Do you want do we want to start with Tracy whilst you are finding your camera then?
No, it should be working. I have no idea why it isn't.
Well, I know you're beautiful, Andy, and everyone saw you earlier, and the keynote and so on. So if you think we need to see you, then we'll wait until your camera reappears. Otherwise, we'll go.
Yeah, I'm not really concerned about being seen so much as that. That if this is host has stopped your video. If we put this out later, a blank screen. Great, would it? Start my video, it says.
That'd be Chris Matthews is the host, so maybe Chris can have a look at that.
Yeah, so maybe we switch, but whilst that is being sorted, we asked Tracy maybe to go first. Is that okay, Tracy?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to do that. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me to be here this evening. I'm delighted to be taking part in these conversations. As mentioned, I'm from Freedom from Torture, a torture rehabilitation centre based here in the UK. For over 30 years, through our services in England and Scotland, we've been helping survivors from around the world overcome their torture and live better, happier lives. Our therapists work with survivors to rebuild their physical and mental health. Our doctors document evidence of torture. Together, we speak out to expose torture and defend the rights of survivors nationally and globally. In recent weeks, the powerful testimony of Majid Khan at his case in Guantanamo, laying out the detail of the horrifying treatment that he had received, both in Guantanamo and elsewhere, and the human response that it elicited from the military jury involved in his case in requesting clemency for him, shows the compelling power of torture survivors reclaiming their voice and their humanity. And this is precisely what the US has attempted to deny to the men detained in Guantanamo all these years, and what the military commission process does little, if nothing, to rectify. As our director of survivor empowerment, Kolbasia Hausu, himself a torture survivor, says, one of the most powerful ways to fight torture is to empower survivors to become agents, first to get rid of the impacts of torture and to live free from what the torturers wanted to achieve, and second, to stand tall against torture by using their voice how they wish to do so. As we have seen from the evidence in the mobilizing power of the testimony of men like Mahamadou Ould Slahi and Mansour Gaddafi, it really is vital if we are going to mobilize the popular support to close Guantanamo, as the previous speaker was calling for. A vital part of that process of empowering survivors is to ensure that they receive the necessary mental health and psychosocial support that will help them to overcome the profound and long-lasting physical and psychological consequences of the torture that they were subjected to. That is not always a possibility in the countries that they are sent to or in Guantanamo itself, and it is something the US should be seeking to rectify. What is repeatedly said to us by survivors that we work with at Freedom from Torture is the importance of seeking some form of justice for what has happened to them. Justice plays an integral role in survivors' recovery as it transforms their individual and private trauma into public acknowledgement by others. The power of feeling believed gives them strength to use their voice and to hold perpetrators accountable. But the military commission process, with all of its flaws and its undermining of the rule of law, does not provide justice to anybody. And by failing to hold those who perpetrated or ordered the use of torture at Guantanamo and other black sites and dark prisons to account, the US is not only withholding justice from those that survived abuse at American hands, but is also undermining the absolute prohibition against torture, as well we know. Earlier this year and last, Freedom from Torture was part of a determined coalition that defeated UK government plans to provide legal protections to British troops that had committed war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Part of the driving force behind our dogged opposition to these proposals was the dismay articulated by the survivors that we work with, that this legislation proposed by the British government would greenlight copycat legislation around the world. Having fled torture in their home countries and having sought protection in the UK, having impunity for torture normalized by a government like the UK filled them with horror. Guantanamo and the normalization of torture and the undermining of due process that it represents stands as a stain on the conscience of America. Whatever attempts by the US government to support democratic or progressive causes elsewhere will always be undermined by its use of torture in the war of terror and its inaction on Guantanamo. I'm Zimbabwean, and I've spent time in detention there for democracy defending activities. My former president, Robert Mugabe, was extremely articulate in pointing out the hypocrisy of US and UK criticism of his government's many human rights abuses, and he was not wrong. In its failure to pursue accountability for its torture program and to expose the true horror of that to the full light of scrutiny means that the US is refusing the opportunity to learn valuable lessons to ensure that this unconstitutional and illegal behavior cannot happen again. By not walking the accountability talk and by pursuing the facade of legality through its military commission process, the US provides example and cover to other human rights abusing states, contributing to the decline in support for the torture ban. President Biden's repeated pledge to shut Guantanamo's doors is welcome, but its former and current detainees will continue to be denied closure until those individuals who perpetrated torture are held to account and all of the detainees have either been charged and tried or released. What we would also like to see is the proper legal mechanisms established so that detainees and former detainees who have been tortured can seek redress, including access to specialist clinical and psychological rehabilitation services. However, the most lasting memorial perhaps would be a commitment from the US government that nothing comparable should ever be allowed to happen again. But in refusing to look backwards, we don't see how that can be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy. That was excellent. We heard a little bit about the nature of the beast of these military commissions and some of the impacts which can be observed. Andy, are you now visual with us? Can I check? Where is he? Andy, have we got you on camera now, or is that fixed or not? I don't know. We don't have Andy in the... okay, so something going on in the background. So maybe we turn to Michelle then, from the Columbia Law School. Is that okay?
I'm happy to do that. I also, just to be clear about my affiliations and what I who I do and do not speak on behalf of, where I speak entirely on behalf of myself. And though I've worked in the Defense Department for over a decade on the military commissions representing detainees, some of whom have been, very much the subject of the questions of torture. And it will not surprise you to know that nothing I say purports to represent the views of the United States, Department of Defense, or any agency or instrumentality thereof. So with that preamble out of the way, just to pick up on I think a very apt point that Tracy made, is one of the most profound perversions of law and justice at Guantánamo, of the many that there are, is how the military commissions were designed and continue to function as an effort to launder evidence obtained by torture. That it is not an exaggeration to say that is why they were created. That is not an exaggeration to say why the rules were written the way they were. The very seeking out of Guantánamo as the place to not only hold detainees, but to hold these tribunals was done because of the assumption early in the Bush administration that it was the legal equivalent of outer space. Or as I think Lord Stein more aptly put it a few years after that, it was a legal black hole, or at least intended to be. And I don't think you can understand the military commissions without thinking of the quote that's contained in the United States Senate's investigation into the Central Intelligence Agency's use of torture from 2014, in which there is a cable from one of the operatives who was responsible for torturing Abu Zubaydah. And the concern he articulates is not necessarily that what they're doing is illegal, but that Abu Zubaydah never see the light of day. We need assurances that Abu Zubaydah will never see the light of day. And that effort to ensure that these men remain voiceless, as Terry said, that what happened to them remains unknown, at best dribbled out in highly redacted documents that maybe you all read, but the public won't read, and that the individuals who did these things will never face any public scrutiny, let alone any kind of criminal accountability, is precisely what the military commissions have been designed to do, and frankly, what they have achieved. They were built from the beginning to launder evidence obtained by torture, to ensure that what was done in secret remains secret. And the few glinting moments when what happened to many of these men comes to light are the moments that we all of a sudden pay attention. And I think the very fact that here we are 20 years later and Majid Khan was able to get up in a military commission and read from a, as I understand it, highly negotiated statement, but publicly, and to speak for himself about what happened to him, that over the course, that took him about 2 hours, as I understand it, to read from beginning to end, and that the reaction of 8 senior military officers, or at least 7 senior military officers, was not only to give him the lowest sentence that they could, or the lowest end of the sentencing range that they were permitted to sentence him, but to write a letter to the convening authority, the administrator of these military tribunals, saying that what was done to Majid Khan was a stain on the United States, and that he should be given clemency in addition to having been given the lowest sentence by this jury, that he should also be given clemency, not necessarily because what he did was not wrong, not because the charges against him weren't serious and that he was guilty of those charges, but because the United States was guilty of betraying its values, the very values that we and Britain fought together against fascism in the 1940s to ensure are not just parochial laws and concerns of countries that claim to respect the rule of law, but are international law, are enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, are jus cogens prohibitions. And so the military commissions, I've spent a great deal of my career, as Andy knows. I remember meeting Andy probably for the first time well over a decade ago in working on these cases. Good to see you, Andy. We're both a bit older now.
And you, Michelle.
And it has been incredibly challenging for a number of reasons, but I think incredibly important, as the Majid Khan case shows. And I would throw out just finally one other thing that I hope you all pay attention to, because one of the individuals I represent is a man named by the name of Abdel Rahim al-Nashri, who was the second person taken into the Central Intelligence Agency's torture program. And we have a case right now pending in the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court underneath the Supreme Court, because the prosecutors in his case have said that they are entitled, without limit, to use evidence obtained directly under torture, so long as that they don't use that evidence at the trial itself, in essence, as evidence in front of the jury. But when arguing to the judge about what evidence can be admitted at that trial, when trying to win motions, whether or not it's on speedy trial or outrageous government conduct or discovery, which is the context in which this issue arose, the government claims free rein to use evidence obtained by torture. And that argument was accepted by the military judge in Guantánamo just this past June. This is not the Bush administration. This is not even the Trump administration. This is during the Biden administration. We've appealed that. The government has attempted to backpedal a little bit without abandoning its argument that it's free to do this. It simply has attempted to what's called moot out the case on procedural grounds. And that is now pending in front of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So I encourage you all to just pay attention to that case, because I think that is going to be it could be a very significant moment, both in the history of the military commissions, but especially in this question of torture. And are these tribunals really going to be the laundromats for torture that they certainly were intended to be when they were first created in 2002, 2003, 4. So.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So that was also really clear. So that really put the spotlight on not unintended consequences, but actually unaccountability by design, by intent from the very beginning, with ongoing consequences across administrations over decades, as I understand it. And I think just to say, but we may get there a bit more, I'm also a job share as a country coordinator for Amnesty International UK for Syria. And of course, even though they're not called necessarily military commissions, President Assad's regime in Syria also has effectively the same institutions where now in Germany and in France, these kind of cases of people who are responsible at low operative medium level are now in courts under universal jurisdiction effectively for abetting and aiding torture, not necessarily even carrying it out themselves. Okay, so, but I think, Andy, your short stint then?
Andy, you're on mute, yeah.
I know, I've figured that out now. Sorry, I had to change computers. Bit of a technical breakdown in the middle of things there. Lovely to see you all again. Very nice to see you again, Michelle. It has been such a long time. You appear, though, not to have aged in the slightest. I don't know how you've managed that, especially with what you've been working on. Anyway, so I was going to talk just a little bit about some thoughts of mine on torture at Guantánamo and torture in the CIA program. So here we go. I'm honored to be taking part in this panel discussion along with Michelle, Tracy, and Norman, because the story of torture is a key part of the story of Guantánamo, as well as one with a grotesque life of its own. What many people don't realize about Guantánamo is how many different agencies and organizations were involved in the interrogation of prisoners. Some of these were charged with building criminal cases and believed in the principles of rapport building rather than abusing prisoners. But others, particularly during the time that Major General Jeffrey Miller was in charge of the prison, 2002 to 2004, were given free rein to indulge in torture and abuse that mirrored what was taking place in the CIA's black sites, although in a generally more chaotic and unfocused manner. An official who spoke to the New York Times many years ago reckoned that around 1/6 of the prisoners held at the time of the prison's maximum population were subjected to these measures. In other words, over 100 men were subjected to the use of loud music and white noise, being moved from cell to cell every few hours over the course of days, weeks, or even months as a method of sleep deprivation that was euphemistically called the frequent flyer program. The use of extreme heat and cold, enforced nudity, sexual abuse, the use of dogs, the shaving of hair and beards, and the use of short shackling in painful positions, to name just some of the techniques used. In addition, in 2 particular cases of Mohammed al-Qahtani and Mohamedou ul-Slahi, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld personally approved the use of a raft of torture techniques. It's also worth noting that indefinite imprisonment without charge or trial can also legitimately be seen as a form of torture. In October 2003, Christophe Giraud of the International Committee of the Red Cross spoke publicly, breaking with the Red Cross's typical protocol, to decry the effects of prolonged and open-ended detention on the prisoner's mental health. The fact that he said that after the prison had been open for less than 2 years only hints at what the effects must be after nearly 20 years. Because we must remember that none of the prisoners have had any opportunity to meet with their family members, even if they could afford to get to Guantánamo, and to this day are only allowed brief video calls to their families. Furthermore, in around 40 cases at least, the men held at Guantánamo were previously held in CIA black sites in Thailand, Poland, Romania, and Lithuania, whose existence was fiercely guarded and only really started to come to light in 2005. It then came under scrutiny by the Council of Europe in a groundbreaking report and in other investigations. And my own research led to my involvement as a lead writer of a UN report on secret detention published in 2010, which focused significantly on the CIA's rendition and torture program. I identified 94 prisoners who had passed through the program, but it wasn't until December 2014 when the executive summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation of the CIA program was published, that it came to light that 119 men had been part of the program, although it was probably more, because the CIA didn't even always bother to count its prisoners properly. In addition, the report didn't cover those sent for torture in proxy prisons in Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, for example, some of whom were never subsequently transferred to CIA custody, and some of whose whereabouts, I think, are still unknown. Shamefully, no one has been held to account for implementing the torture program, just as no one has been held accountable for the crimes committed at Guantánamo. There have been several challenges in the US courts, but these sadly have tended to be derailed by the government cynically invoking the state secrets privilege, used not to protect national security as intended, but to shield the government from the release of evidence demonstrating its involvement in wrongdoing which it is clear has in many cases risen to the level of war crimes. It is, of course, essential that all of us who care about the rule of law should continue to press for accountability, and also for the full Senate Intelligence Committee report to be published, and not just its executive summary, even though its revelations, over 500 pages rather than the full report's 6,500 pages, were a damning indictment of the cruelty and futility of the program. The committee concluded, to name just a few of its findings, that torture was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees, that the CIA made inaccurate claims about the effectiveness of the program in an attempt to justify it, and that it led to friction with other agencies that endangered national security, as well as providing false statements that led to costly and worthless wild goose chases. How can it be that, we all have to ask, such a disastrous policy can have been implemented, damaging or destroying so many lives, and leading in some cases to fatalities, murders, and yet no one can be held accountable? Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. That's great. So geographically and in terms of core complicity, you brought the European Union and Europe, member states there, and NATO members as well into the fray, as well as the Middle East and North Africa through these black sites and extraordinary rendition. And this includes, is understood, both the UK and Germany, for instance, as well as a couple of other countries, Poland, Bulgaria, and so on.
Yeah.
So we widened our geographical scope quite considerably now in a web of complicity in the extraordinary rendition and the torture, which was central.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And I think it's worth noticing that all of these countries knew that at some level what they were doing was wrong. The only country that claimed that it had rewritten the rules so that what it was doing wasn't wrong was the United States. Every other country, when they took part in it, was much more aware that that conjuring up a new paradigm was something that wasn't legally viable, so that they knew they were crossing a line into things that were wrong. And it helps to explain why nobody really wants people to dig deeply and hold people accountable.
Yeah, and those countries probably, it's fair to say, not only knew what they were doing, but semi-forced to actually eventually talk about it in terms of governments, agencies, and so on. Right. Okay, but I'll turn to Norman now. Norman, could you enlighten us with your contribution?
I don't know if I can enlighten you, but I'll give you a contribution nevertheless. Let me say that I've been asked to do this at very, very short notice indeed. And also, I'm not an expert on military tribunals, but it may be that I can offer some political observations that are useful in the debate that you're having. I was in Parliament in 2001 when the 9/11 occurred, or 11/9 as I prefer to call it in the British system. And I recall the febrile environment which was created by that. I remember being told by people with straight faces that terrorists were trying to destroy our democratic values, and therefore we were going to adopt a whole range of measures which destroyed our democratic values to respond to them, which seemed to me to be somewhat counterproductive. And what alarmed me about that, and goes with Guantánamo as part of this, what alarmed me was the readiness, almost enthusiasm, of Western democracies, particularly the United States, who had over many, many years fought to improve their democratic status, to enhance civil liberties, to rejoice in those civil liberties and hold up to the world as values to be envied. We're prepared to wash these away almost overnight, as if it was somehow necessary, and little consideration seemed to me was given to how on earth we could respond to the situation that had unfolded in a way which respected our democratic values. So that was a worry, and it worries me how democracies can suddenly lose their values, because I believe it's much easier to lose values than it is to regain them. And we haven't really regained them all. And we just heard from Andy how no one's been held to account for what happened in Guantánamo. And the same might be said for other aspects of that historical period. It was a period when we were all told, for example, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and a whole lot of dodgy dossiers were created, which parliamentarians were supposed to vote for. And just put on record that I didn't. I voted against that. But nevertheless, the count was carried in Parliament. As far as the United Kingdom is concerned, the United Kingdom, I think, behaved in ways which were similar to other Western countries outside America, which was to evince sympathy for the states, understandably, for the loss of life and the attacks which had happened in New York and elsewhere, but then to be complicit in the extraordinary response of the Americans in abandoning statutory defenses and civil liberties, which were so inherent to what we call the leaders of the free world. We knew that there were black sites. We knew what was happening in Guantánamo. We didn't do very much about it. And indeed, what the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, did was, in fact, mislead Parliament. I'm not just talking about dodgy dossiers, but, for example, he was challenged about the use of British territory for extraordinary rendition. And his response was to suggest to anyone who believed that British territory was used for extraordinary rendition was, quote, a conspiracy theorist, unquote. That, of course, turned out to be not true, because we subsequently discovered Ascension Island was used for flights. So the House of Commons was misled. So lying to Parliament was apparently now acceptable in terms of this process. So we were abandoning our values. We were endorsing illegal behavior. I think it was illegal behavior in the United States. And ministers were now lying to Parliament to cover matters up. Of course, it is the case that we would normally expect that anyone who is deemed to be a terrorist, potentially a terrorist, obviously have to be convicted, or ought to be convicted, should be subject to normal court procedures and the normal safeguards which apply in the courts. None of that, of course, has happened at Guantánamo, let alone the torture, which, of course, has been endemic, indefensible, and ineffective. I don't believe, as a matter of fact, that torture, even if you think it's desirable, and some politicians apparently do, I don't even think it works. So it's pretty useless anyway, because people will say, well, you have to say in that situation. So we should have had a process where people were properly treated according to law. We've not had that. And what the epilogue, if you like, from this, or the entrails, is that people around the world, governments around the world, have learned that they can subvert the rule of law when it suits them, and they can get away with it, because that's what's happened. And that's one of the factors, I believe, along with the public response, which is to trust politicians less and less, perhaps understandably, that has led to a coterie of so-called strong leaders emerging around the world, most of whom are pretty ghastly, like Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, and Putin, none of whom respect democratic values. So what is my conclusion from all this? Well, Guantánamo should be shut, of course, and people there should be either released and compensated, or they should be subject to some sort of proper trial with proper safeguards. And it's deeply depressing to me that what was done by Bush and Rumsfeld was not undone by Obama or Biden. It's really quite shocking to hear that matters are still going on now which have not been corrected, and people have been there for 20 years or thereabouts without any proper legal safeguards or the basics that you would expect for any prisoner held in jail in a Western democracy. What we have to do is to make sure that we do not allow these circumstances to arise again. What does that mean? It means we must have an independent judiciary prepared to stand up and be counted, even if it's unpopular, even if they're called enemies of the people by the Daily Mail on the front page. We must have the Geneva Convention and European Commission on Human Rights respected. We need to have a strong parliament and a proper opposition, and that requires courage, but it also requires, in my view, properly proportional representation. So we don't have a government formed in this country with 29.7% of the people eligible to vote having elected it with an 80-seat majority. It requires a diverse media, not all controlled by Rupert Murdoch or people like that, but actually with investigative journalists prepared to dig into matters. It requires a Freedom of Information Act in each country, and one which works. And I noticed that the number of requests to central government in this country for freedom of information have been steadily increasing in terms of refusals in recent years. It requires people in Western governments to be held to account, ideally through the International Criminal Court, which should be there not simply for African countries, as it appears to be, but for Western countries as well. If we diversify power, if we enable people to find out what's going on, if we have independent sources who can hold governments to account, then we got some chance of preventing this from happening again. That's the agenda which needs to be taken forward. If we don't have that, those building blocks in place, then the danger is this will occur again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Norman. And that was, you know, a strong liberal outlook as well. And so one of the things which comes out is some tension, I guess, and that's, you know, going into the discussion now. But before I do that, I've noticed in the chat, Marie-Louise Paris has said she will cover Ireland and its connection to extraordinary renditions and France on her academic paper tomorrow. So 2 more countries covered tomorrow. So one of the things is possibly the tension between civil liberties and the values, and then what you might describe anti-terrorism legislation or policy in practice. In the UK, there is an independent reviewer, which we've all followed with major interest over the years, different people, and that tension and potentially, drifting in positions and dragged by government to be more recommending governments or authorities to have power. So that's one area I'd like to discuss with you. If you make some statements or contributions, or ask each other, what does it say actually about our contemporary systems and where they go, not just in Belarus, but in the countries which we luckily reside and live in. And the other one is to go back to the pain and suffering of those who underwent the process, including the torture or solitary confinement and so on, and whether you think there's any processes of transitionary justice which could kick in and which are attached with accountability. So these are two sort of areas, unless I get questions in the chat or people holding up their hands. So maybe the first one, do you think whether there's actually institutions or arrangements which are sufficiently strong or could be strengthened to have more checks and balances, as the Americans might call it, in this system, to hold the executive and the executive agencies, official or unofficial, secret agencies and so on, to account? Can we do anything there? Can anything be done with campaign to actually or resources or public pressure or electoral processes to actually strengthen these types of institutions, organizations?
If I can jump in there, Richard, on that question, really with regard to the UK as opposed to the US. I think that the calls for a judge-led inquiry into the UK's involvement in post 9/11 rendition and torture really needs to go ahead. There was a commitment made by government that they would do this, and then now every subsequent government since then has been backtracking. And I really do not believe that any intelligence agency or security agency can be relied upon to monitor or hold themselves accountable. We've been assured that there have been reviews of policies and process, etc., etc. Well, I'm sorry, I think that if there really had been lessons learned, then that should be open to scrutiny. And if that doesn't necessarily mean public scrutiny, then at least parliamentary scrutiny. And so I think that there definitely are steps that could be taken here in the UK at least, and that the pressure should be put upon the government to go ahead and constitute that judge-led inquiry into the UK's complicity.
Very much so. Michelle, have you got an observation to offer? What do you think from, speaking as an academic, where you think this might be triggered from or supported? You're muted, I think.
Sorry, there, is that better? Sorry about that. No, I do think we're actually in a moment where I'm not going to say the dam is breaking, but I do think the judiciary in the United States, which has been largely quiescent to the demands of national security over the past 20 years, has really, even in the past year, shown a keen interest to dig into and even maybe resolve questions that it had found every procedural mechanism at its disposal to avoid for much of the past 2 decades. There's a very prominent case in the District of Columbia Circuit right now dealing with whether or not Guantánamo detainees generally have due process rights under the United States Constitution. It's amazing to think here we are 20 years later and we don't have such a basic question resolved. But that gives you a sense of how, I'll generously say, reluctant the courts have been in providing any kind of supervisory role. But they've for a complicated set of reasons, decided to finally grab that question now and to address it. I think the Supreme Court's willingness to engage in the case of Abu Zubaydah, who, which some of you may have seen, there's a case now pending in the United States Supreme Court where the government is challenging Abu Zubaydah's ability to participate with a foreign criminal prosecution that he is sponsoring in an effort to hold individuals accountable for torture, Abu Zubaydah still being in Guantanamo. I think, most commentators, I won't make a projection myself, but there's a chance I think the Supreme Court might not give Abu Zubaydah all the relief he wanted, but there was some extremely pointed question from various sides of the partisan divide on the Supreme Court. Justice Gorsuch specifically, which is surprising given his earlier service in the Bush administration on Guantanamo issues, where he sort of flatly pushed the government to stipulate that they would allow Abu Zubaydah to testify himself. So they wouldn't require, in other words, they wouldn't require the government to turn over classified information potentially to a foreign government investigation, but would they allow Abu Zubaydah to testify? And given some of my remarks earlier, I think that it was Abu Zubaydah specifically is kind of remarkable, because his detention for the past 20 years very much has been designed to ensure he never sees the light of day. And that is something that Justice Neil Gorsuch knows, and was still willing to push the government on, and that how that shakes out again remains to be seen. But the very willingness of the courts to start engaging on issues that for the longest time have been totally off limits, I think is remarkable. And then I would again point to the al-Nashiri case, which is in the DC circuit now. That it remains to be seen how the court will handle that, whether or not they'll look for ways of punting it. They always, that is always an option. But again, I'm not going to say the dam is breaking, but it does seem that there is there's some kind of shift going on, and the courts are willing to reassert themselves in ways that they haven't for the past 10, 15 years. So I think there is room for optimism.
Yes, very much so.
Not normally what you hear at a conference like this.
No, absolutely. No. I actually was looking forward to hear that, because there is then hope with stamina and with the right openings and the right people who are brave enough and in the right positions to actually pursue this and to maybe get, at the very least, accountability and hopefully also justice. I think one of our distinguished conference speakers and guests has said in the chat, commenting off what Tracy said, my concern, Tracy, is a number of inquiries, parliamentary, judge-led, whatever, have ended up being completely pointless with no genuine accountability as a result. That's the counter voice, if you like, on that. But I think, as they say, the jury's perhaps out still. Tracy, I think, and then Norman as well, I think Freedom from Torture at times also has written country reports, which have, detailed, like other organizations do, practices, systematic practices with torture and so on, and linking that to potentially asylum processes and so on. But the other thing, Freedom from Torture, I understand, has also been interested in, released a couple of things on, is transitionary justice. In other words, you may never have the pain removed, and the people who went through that ordeal and that torture, they will have the scars for life. But if they get a voice, and if they're part of educating, helping society, nationally, internationally, about the serious abuses of the processes, maybe that can help, and even them psychologically, when systems and outcomes are changed, when a voice is given and systems are changed, policy changed, and when accountability, including perhaps prosecutions at least, or even convictions of perpetrator happens. So I wonder whether Norman and you might say something about that, whether that's a concept you find interesting, transitionary justice.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can jump in there, we're actually about to embark on a project in early 2022, together with our partner organization, Survivor Speak Out Network, on identifying survivor priorities for justice, which we hope will serve as a guidance for policymakers and also for a better understanding by the public here in the UK as to what the people who are arriving here seeking protection have escaped from and what they would need to rebuild their lives. But what's really been clear from ordinary conversation is how important standing up and advocating for some form of justice or redress, because obviously that can be quite a wide spectrum, whether that's rehabilitation, international, being granted international protection, or whether that's compensation or even a criminal proceeding. The wide spectrum is that it really is a vital component of the rehabilitation process for survivors, and that it aids greatly in rehabilitation. We're also doing a clinical study on whether actually taking part in activism contributes towards, or how that impacts on the rehabilitation process, and that's something that we're hoping to get the findings of in the coming months. So it is certainly something that we know from general conversation is vitally important to survivors, and what we're looking to do is provide a documentation or something that puts down survivor priorities of what justice means to them, and what the different types of justice, not purely criminal proceedings, might look like.
Great.
Just to follow through, I mean, I agree with what Tracy said there, so I won't repeat it. I'll just give you a parallel, which I dealt with when I was a minister at the Home Office, which was dealing with predominantly women who were coming to this country having been trafficked, and the need to ensure that they were dealt with sympathetically and their voices heard, and to make sure they were enabled to rebuild their lives. And also to deal with the fact that half the time they were being accused of being illegal immigrants, which was hardly very helpful to the process. On the judge-led inquiry, yes, a judge-led inquiry may not work, but what's the alternative? The alternative cannot be to do nothing. And therefore, that's probably the best of a bad job. You could have an inquiry by, say, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in Parliament, but inevitably, you're bringing party issues then as to who was responsible for what at what particular time. Generally speaking, the further away you get from an event, and although Guantánamo is still there, you know, the big fire, if you like, was 20 years ago when it started and so on. Generally, the further away you get from an event, the easier it is to have an inquiry, not least of all because the players who were there taking decisions have by and large left the stage. And certainly civil service take the view that they can be far more open and frank if the politicians they were responding to aren't still in office. And it's noticeable that the inquiries into the Iraq War became more useful as time went on, for example, rather than the initial ones. So I think an inquiry may be useful. By the way, I would just say also, in terms of one comment that I made earlier on, my experience, and it may be anecdotal if you like, and it may not be accurate, but my experience was that the security services, by and large, would stick to the rules. It was the politicians who wanted to bend the rules rather than the security services.
So thank you. I think Deepa you had your hand up earlier, or yeah.
Thank you. Firstly, I just wanted to thank all the panelists. It was just fascinating to hear you speak. And my question is, but probably specifically for Norman and Michelle. I hope I pronounced the name right. But I'm curious about Norman, in relation to the point you made about having a judge-led inquiry, given that most of the British judiciary is unrepresentative of the common man and therefore shares certain class interests, so to speak, with much of the elite who are intent on oppressing the rest of the world. And given that we have not made progress with things like the Pat Finucane inquiry, with other inquiries which have, are of incidents that have taken place a significant time ago, I'm curious to see what besides inquiries, which I'm not against, but slightly more skeptical about, perhaps, whether there may be other ways in which to engage. And one of the points you talked about was the Freedom of Information Act. And I'm keen to understand what role things like the Information Clearinghouse now have on impacting the kinds of answers that we get, and whether the Freedom of Information Act still remains something which can be used to extract the kind of information we need.
Well, on those 2 points, is it digitally perfect? No, it isn't. Is it full of people who represent the common man, as you put it, or common woman on the Clapham omnibus, perhaps? Not generally speaking, but they are independent and they are a bulwark against government. So they do take their job seriously and try to reach genuinely independent and correct decisions. And they're not frightened of taking on the government. You'll have seen the Supreme Court in this country unanimously criticised the government for attempting to prorogue Parliament, for example. So they're not afraid to take decisions. They no longer say, who are the Beatles, which they might have asked years ago from the bench, but they probably still ask, you know, who is Ed Sheeran or something. But you know, they're not perfect, but they are genuinely independent, and I think they are. You know, well, I'm very glad they're there rather than not there in this country. Put it that way. I'm sorry, what was the second point you made? I forgot the second point.
Freedom of Information Act and
the Freedom of Information Act. Yes. Well, look, I mean, the Freedom of Information Act was a huge innovation, because until that came in, the assumption was that all information had to be secret unless someone decided it should be open, and the Freedom of Information Act reversed that, so everything should be open unless someone decides it's secret. Now, where it's gone wrong has that governments have become more adept at finding reasons not to release information within the Act. So they say something is a state secret. Well, you can't prove whether it is a state secret or not because you haven't got the information to demonstrate that. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's less useful than it might be. It depends on the government of the day. And interestingly, if you draw a graph, which I have done actually, you'll find that when a new government comes in, the release of information goes up, and then it slowly declines in terms of percentage of answers given, properly answers given, until the next government comes in, it goes up again. So that's the kind of shape of the answers which are given out. So it's not perfect. That you can find out insignificant information, but anything which is hugely sensitive, they will probably not give out. Having said that, there is a process which operates where you can appeal to eventually to the Independent Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner, successive Information Commissioners have released information, forced information out, which the government of the day hasn't wanted. For example, Prince Charles's black spider letters, writing to government ministers, interfering in matters which he should be keeping well out of. You know, the Information Commissioner forced those out. The Information Commissioner also forced out, under the Labour government, all the people that Tony Blair had invited to Chequers, which is kind of Z-list celebrities. You know, so we found all those people. So it can be useful. It doesn't always work, but it's certainly worth having.
I guess, you know, the current government, the current sitting Conservative government under Prime Minister Boris Johnson tries to get through effectively legislation to bar further prosecutions for offences by state personnel, army personnel in Northern Ireland, which also is, you know, connected because these were essentially under a military regime and with orders and government and going back. So, and that also pertains to what was redacted, non-redacted, you know, these people having special privileges of first having a sight of what was going to be released and so on. But one other thing, we only have a couple of more minutes. Do we really, or should we, or can we only talk about state actors? Or should we also think about non-state actors who are actually at times in control, effective control of people and territory, and you know, pursue mechanisms of torture quite clearly as well? And if our governments and our agencies break the values, can we actually then talk about what non-state actors should or shouldn't do, and acting against them, if you like? Any views on that from any of you?
I can have a, I mean, at Freedom from Torture, we very much, in terms of our, in our acceptance of clients, we very much stick to the Convention Against Torture's definition of torture, but that does extend to groups that hold territorial control. And so we assist a wide range of people who have been tortured by the Taliban or by Daesh or other groups that hold territorial control in a variety of other geographical areas. Of course, when it comes to seeking accountability, the international laws, etc., only really hold with states, and states who've ratified international conventions, and so I do think that it's a very interesting question, right? And it's something that we are grappling now with Afghanistan and the current government of Afghanistan, who just a couple of months ago were a non-state actor, and how do you seek to get assurances from said actors that they will abide by rules and norms of international behaviors or rules of engagement and warfare, etc. And it's not one that we have yet been able to comfortably navigate as an organization that's seeking accountability. But what we do recognize is that that states or groups that de facto control people's lives should have the same responsibility as a state.
Great. Yeah, and I can also say that Amnesty International as a global movement and the International Secretariat and the Dutch section leading on that is also working on a program on accountability, which faces some of the same challenges and tries to go into some of the same directions. And of course, it's tied also to what governments, including the UK government, prefers to have and trust and thinks it's legit, which many of us don't, is these so-called assurances or robust assurances tied to deportations, which is probably, many people would say, not worth the paper and are not written on or are written on.
If I may, Richard, may I also just make another point relating to your comment about Northern Ireland? Because obviously something that interests us greatly is the lack of accountability of techniques that were developed in Kenya, in Belfast, and that found their way through to Bagram, to Baghdad, to Cuba, the so-called 5 techniques, and their history. And I think this really is a warning signal to all of us, right? If we refuse to look backwards, if we say, oh no, we just need to go forward and focus on what's possible, that these cycles perpetuate. And by refusing accountability or refusing to insist on accountability for past actions is how we end up then with future techniques that have been developed and skilled up and refined, I should say. And I find it, we're finding it deeply alarming, the fact that the proposed amnesty legislation that's coming for Northern Ireland, and the ramifications for what that means for other groups who have been subjected to torture in other jurisdictions, and what this means for the fact that these techniques might find their way through to yet another conflict in the future, because everything just gets brushed under the carpet.
I think that's almost a perfect ending, unless you want each of you to have a final sentence. We can grant you that, I think, and otherwise our time is more or less up. So, final parting shots, observations, rallying cries, whatever philosophies which the other panelists might want to add in addition.
I would just say thank you for inviting me and staying up late to hear us all speak.
Thank you.
Right, okay, well look, thank you very much. It was an amazingly interesting panel and lots to think about. In fact, we've just done 5 hours straight about